All right, good morning. So we have two things on today's agenda. Number one, we're going to conclude the Rebbe's commentary on the MAH NISHTANA, the four questions. A couple of little comments that are interesting and are to pique a little curiosity, to be on topic, all about curiosity. And then we'll go from there to the next Mishnah in our Gemara. So let's begin. We're looking at the packet, little pamphlet of the Rebbe's Haggadah, page Lamed Test, bottom left of page Lamed Test, which is the third page in the packet. So it's the inside fold, left-hand side, bottom left corner.
Third page.
I think third page. No?
I found it.
Yeah, Lamed Test, bottom corner. Okay, so now that we have the undergirding structure of the four questions, how it came about. Right, so if you will, we can have, let's say, three levels to the MAH NISHTANA, three levels and three stages. Number one is, stage one would be Rashbam's opinion that any question is good enough, doesn't have to be the four questions at all, as long as the child asks something. Move the plate away, fill the second cup, broke the middle matzah, dipped, whatever the questions are, as long as the kid is curious, we're good to go. Rashbam's view. Level two would be, okay, you got to ask these questions where the sages instituted an outline of what the question should be. And let's say we'll take this as Tosfos's view, that the curiosities you're getting from the kid from doing all these other actions is to get them to the MAH NISHTANA, but doesn't necessarily have to be in order. Doesn't even necessarily have to be all four, but these are the things you should be talking about. And then at that point in history, you have a bunch of different customs, all following the overlying structure, until eventually, while the temple is still standing, the custom becomes uniform, and everybody asks all five questions as Rambam's view in the same order. And that leaves us today where the question about roasting is deleted, and we have the four questions, or not deleted, temporarily suspended until the temple is rebuilt, maybe speedily nowadays. So that's where we left off. And as we explained, this is kind of a window into, in general, how customs emerge. The source that the Rebbe cited to is, the sample source that the Rebbe cited to is the blowing of the shofar, and how that custom evolved as well, in terms of what the teruah is, the set in the middle, should sound like, whether it's like the whales or the panting, like the shavarim or teruah. How the custom evolved and was organized by Rabbi Levi. And this also gives us a window into how, in general, Jewish liturgy, the Siddur, evolves over time. So with that, now we'll look at a few comments from the Rebbe on the specific questions that are mentioned in the MAH NISHTANA.
What's the purpose of bringing up the shofar?
Okay, the purpose that we're trying to say is they were citing to a source where there's explicit source for this idea that you start off with a structure that allows for multiple customs, and then it becomes uniform over time. That's an example. They're just borrowing that model and saying the same thing happened with the MAH NISHTANA. In other words, there's no explicit source that says about the MAH NISHTANA that it evolved in this manner, but there is an explicit source that says that it evolved in that way by the shofar. That it started off with an outline of how you should do it, multiple customs, and then uniformed by the sages. And everybody's taking that model and saying the same thing must have happened with the MAH NISHTANA, which would explain why there's varying texts in the manuscripts, because that predates their uniformity. Okay, bottom left. The first question was why we dip twice. Shtei pa'amim. Tonight we dip twice, and year-round we don't even dip once. That was question one. Comments the Rebbe, based on the Taz. Afshemat bilin gimel pa'amim, even though we dip three times actually. We dip the karpas in the salt water, it's one. Morer and charaises, and then the kairach. The sandwich also is dipped in charaises. The morer of the sandwich is also dipped in charaises. It's actually three times. But we don't say in the question, tonight we dip three, and we never dip once. We say we dip twice. Explains the Rebbe, based on the Taz, Tfilas ha-maror v'chazeres, because the dipping of the maror and the chazeres, which is the maror that's going to be in the sandwich, the kairach of the sandwich, ke'echad chashivi is considered one, because it's dipping maror in charoses. It so happens to be you're eating maror twice, once alone and once with other matzah, especially as the Rebbe and the Rebbe learned it. We spoke about this with the kairach files before Pesach, that the eating of kairach is actually in fulfillment of the mitzvah of maror. We learned this. So certainly the two dippings, once at maror, once at the kairach, once at the sandwich, is really one dipping. And therefore the question can indeed say, why did we dip twice? Even though technically we're dipping 3 times, because time number 2 is really once divided into two marors. Okay. Comment number 1. Comment number 2, top page mem. Our text is, and this we actually, if you'll remember, we looked at this Tosfos that the Rebbe is citing to here. Halayla hazeh morar. On question number 3, we ask, on all the nights we eat other vegetables, and tonight we eat morar. When it comes, this is a bit different than the way the question is phrased with respect to matzah. With respect to matzah, the question is phrased as follows. All other nights of the year, we eat matzah and maror. Tonight, we eat only matzah. When it comes to maror, we don't say that word only. We don't say all of the nights we eat other vegetables, and tonight we eat only maror. We don't say that. We say all the nights we eat other vegetables, and tonight we eat maror. Why don't we say only? What's the simple answer? Because we eat other vegetables. And not only do we eat other vegetables, actually it's best to eat other vegetables. When? Meaning a person could forgo eating salad, but he's still going to be eating another vegetable besides for maror. When? Let's say he's forgoing salad, but he's still going to be eating another vegetable besides for maror. When? As a requirement. At the karpas. It's best not to have maror, because then you get into the whole problem that we mentioned before, that once you're eating maror for the karpas, now you have to start making a bracha on maror. And did you fulfill your obligation at that point? Did you not fulfill your obligation at that point? So it's actually at karpas best not to have maror. You have to have a vegetable. And therefore, we cannot say tonight we only eat maror, even if you decided not to have salad for dinner. And that comes from the Tosfos, which Rebbe cites to here. So top of page mem. Halayla hazeh maror. Tonight we eat maror. Einoi oimar kuloi maror. In the question, we don't say tonight we only eat maror, as we say by matzah. Tonight we only eat matzah. Why? Because we actually are required to eat other vegetables at the first dipping, at the dipping in salt water, the karpas. Or actually, according to Rambam, you're dipping in charoses at the first dipping, but you're dipping a different vegetable, not the maror. Okay. Now, as for the question that was omitted from our, or is temporarily suspended from our 4 questions, the roasting. All of the nights of the year we eat meat that's either cooked or roasted. But tonight we only eat roasted. That's from our Mishnah, the Rebbe says. Says the Rebbe, this is indeed the question they would have asked when the temple stood, and we will ask again when the temple stands. Now, last comment from the Rebbe. Sorry, what were we saying?
Just thinking why we would have left that question out, because we wouldn't be roasted.
Correct. We don't eat roasted. We avoid roasted today.
Yeah.
Today we avoid roasted because we don't want it to appear as if we're eating a carbon not in the proper place, not in the proper manner. Now, finally, Alan kept on asking, why don't we ask about the 4 cups of wine? Now why don't we ask about the 4 cups of wine? Why isn't that on the 4 questions? All of the night of the years we drink 1 cup of wine, the Kiddush. Tonight we drink 4 cups. Why not?
It was because of Moses brought you out of Egypt.
What does it have to do? How does that explain why we don't ask the question?
That's what I believe that
it didn't come from Moshe Rabbeinu. The 4 cups of wine come much later, probably from the Anshin Haggadah. It's rabbinic, yeah, that's the answer. From the Rebbe, from the Maharal, there it says as follows. Yeah. The origin of the 4 questions comes from the 4 expressions of freedom that Moshe Rabbeinu said in the Torah.
Yeah.
But that's actually Hashem says, but through Moshe Rabbeinu. But he did not institute the 4 cups of wine, though. The 4 cups of wine come much later, in probably the Anshe Knesset Haggadah, probably the men of the Great Assembly at the beginning of the Second Temple period. That's my guess of when it started. Maybe a little later, even. So the question is, why don't we have that as part of the 4 questions? So says the Rebbe based from Maral. We do not ask regarding the obligation to drink 4 cups. Why? It is completely a rabbinic enactment. And it has no element that is biblical. Okay, go through all the 4 questions and tell me if all of them are biblical. Dipping twice, is that biblical? Nope.
Well, it is through it has some element because of the Mara.
So it has an element of biblical, which is what I'm about to say.
I got that from you I picked up on it when you said there's no.
No, there you go. Thank you.
Thinking, okay,
That's right. So the dipping twice, it has an element of rabbinic because it's connected to Maror. Even though today Maror is not rabbinic, but Maror is still mentioned in the Torah as a biblical idea, and it was when the temple stood, and when the temple will stand, it'll become biblical again, and we dip associated with that. So it's tangentially biblical. Dipping into Maror, which once was biblical, okay? What about, the next question is matzah. Okay, matzah is biblical. Maror has the biblical also itself. Itself used to be biblical. What about leaning? That's not biblical, it's rabbinic.
It's not part of that.
Where's the biblical element? It is part of the 4 questions. In our times, it is. So it's not biblical. Leaning is not biblical, but there's got to be a biblical element. Whereas the wine has no biblical element.
Is it because it's
Where's the biblical element? Let's see. So let's see. We don't ask about the 4 questions. Because it's completely rabbinic. There's no element of biblical. Mashenkin has sebab, not by contrast, leaning. While one eats matzah, one is obligated to lean. So even though leaning itself is not biblical, it's got an element of biblical in that you fulfill the mitzvah of leaning during a time when you're also fulfilling a biblical, which is matzah. And as respect to dipping, the second dipping is by maror, which was biblical, or is biblical in origin.
Learning about leaning as a separate mitzvah or combined, or
that's right.
And it's both. Actually.
And it's both. So if it's an element, and or considering that we learned that leaning is both independent mitzvah, which is certainly rabbinic, but also an element of the mitzvah, an element of matzah. So an element of biblical matzah is a rabbinic obligation to lean. Even though it's rabbinic, but it's still an element of the mitzvah of biblical.
4 questions because it's part of the mitzvah of matzah.
That's right. So the 4 questions, therefore, are limited to that which has at least some biblical origin, whereas the wine has no biblical origin or no biblical element of obligation, even though it's based on the verses in the biblical. Even though it's based on the words of Scripture, but the obligation doesn't stem from those words. It's associated with those words. It doesn't stem from those words. Those words don't allude to wine. Those words just describe Hashem taking us out of Egypt, so we drink wine in commemoration of that. But the obligation doesn't stem from those words. Whereas in matzah, the words are explicit in the verse, the maror is explicit from the verse. The dipping stems from the obligation to eat maror, and the leaning stems or is built into the obligation to eat matzah. Okay, this concludes the Rebbe's comments on the 4 questions, and now we're ready to go to the Mishnah. So I'm going to stop the recording and start another one, so that way it's easier for my little playlists online.